Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Café on Tampa Online. I'm Bill Carlson here with my program co-chair, Del Acosta. Del, please introduce our speaker.
Well, good morning, Bill, and good morning to the Café con Tampa family as we meet in safe distance. Today, we have a very topical program, Political Communication in Turbulent Times. Our speaker is Dr. Joshua Scacco, Assistant Professor of Communications at USF and faculty researcher with the USF Nielsen Sunshine State Survey. Dr. Scacco, please tell us a little bit about the USF Nielsen Sunshine State Survey and a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks so much, Bill and Del, for having me this morning. Hello, everyone, and good morning. My name is Dr. Joshua Scacco. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication, where I focus on political communication. And some of what I'm going to be chatting with you all about this morning is related to our April survey of 600 Floridians with the USF Nielsen Sunshine State Survey. The survey is a statewide assessment in this particular instance of attitudes and opinions related to the coronavirus pandemic. So we asked individuals specifically about government performance, about government policies of mitigation for the coronavirus. So some of what I'll be sharing this morning will be specifically related to that, as well as some insights related to thinking about political communication in general from our political leaders during this particular time.
Great, and for everybody who's watching, please, we do this so that we can share information broadly with the public, and we offer this service for free. So please hit the share button and share it on your feed with your friends and family. And also, Café con Tampa style, if you're watching this live, 8 o'clock on Friday morning, you can post a question either underneath the feed if you're watching on your phone, or to the right if you're watching on your PC. Josh, tell us about some of the initial findings of the survey, if you could, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we found in general was that there was widespread concern among Floridians related to the coronavirus. A majority of individuals were concerned that they would be personally affected or infected by the virus in the next 3 months. They were also 3/4 of our survey respondents were concerned that someone they know would be affected as well. And so thinking in some ways about what this meant for things like attending to the news more, which is what we saw in the survey. Individuals were reporting that they were watching the news or reading the news more. 2/3 of our survey respondents were either getting a lot or some information from President Trump's daily press briefings in April. About 60% of Floridians that we surveyed were getting a lot or some information from Governor DeSantis's press briefings about the coronavirus. So this was really an important environment where concern was leading to information searching and seeking behaviors. And that's really important for thinking about how political leaders communicate about the public health crisis, and as well as where we're at currently with thinking about issues like a mandated mask requirement that both Tampa and St. Petersburg are considering at the particular moment, and what that will mean going forward.
Josh, there's been a number of surveys and a lot of information thrown out there. As a consumer, how can we tell correct information from what is sometimes known as fake news?
So this is probably the most important question, and also the most prominent question I get from my students, which is where to look for particular accurate information, reliable information. And there are a couple of things that I tell my students. The first is that no one information source will give you the complete picture of what's going on. So what I usually do is describe how I get my information, and I tell my students that I look at one newspaper, I look at one television news source, and then one online news source, and then do some cross-checking on my own. But beyond that, there are other strategies as well. So from as simply as looking at the URL, the hyperlink of a news site, to make sure that there is, if it's a government website, that's a .gov website. If it's a news website, there's no weird link that takes you to some other type of website. you want to make sure that the information is current, so that if it is covering information, for example, on the coronavirus in February, it will look very different than what we know now in June related to the coronavirus. So making sure it's current. And then finally, making sure that if it's a news article, that there is a reputable journalist or reporter who is writing the story or behind the story. And that can be done with a simple Google search. So the key thing is it takes a little bit of extra work to make sure that the information you're looking at is accurate, but it's also worth it in making sure that you're not necessarily falling victim to something that is intentional false information that we see online, particularly related to the coronavirus. So intentionally putting out false information is disinformation, and then unintentional false information would be misinformation.
Let me hit on a sensitive topic or important topic at this point. We know that because of the Facebook algorithms, that people have been watching more and more news tailored to what their interests are. So if you're in art, you'll read a lot of art stuff. If you're a Democrat, you'll see mostly Democratic information. If you're a Republican, you'll see mostly Republican information. So as that's happened, we're all in these bubbles unless we somehow break out of it. But if you look at the two crises we're in right now, so the COVID-19 pandemic and then also the protests, it seems that people are also getting their information along partisan lines or within those bubbles. How do we get to a point, do you think, in the future where there will be some common ground? You know, it used to be that everybody watched the same news, and so we all had the same starting point. Now we have different starting points. How do we find a middle ground in communicating?
Yeah, so I think the first thing on an individual level is recognition of our own biases in terms of how we look for information, in terms of the sources that we attend to. So one of the things we want to think about is this source of information, the kind of the question that I ask myself or that I tell my students to think about is this source of information comforting to me because it's only encouraging me to think the same that I already think? Or is it challenging my set of beliefs? Those I think are particularly important for assessing in these individual situations what's happening. So I'll give you an idea, Bill and Del, some of the things that we found in terms of the survey, in terms of the Sunshine State survey. So we found, for example, that Republican Floridians were more likely than Democrats and independents to be watching the president's daily press conferences in April. So this is unsurprising. Republicans were tuning in to a like-minded political figure talking about the coronavirus in April. But what we also find is that when we look at, for example, support for policies, in our April survey, we find that 80% of Floridians were supportive of a face mask requirement, for a statewide face mask requirement to wear face masks in public places. The key thing to keep in mind here, though, is that when you look at some of the partisan differences, we were beginning to see partisan splits on that issue. So 80% is actually an interesting data point because according to the most recent research, to get to the level where you can no longer transmit or reduce transmission of the virus publicly, you need 80% compliance from the public. So you need 80% of a public to be wearing face masks. So this is why particularly in a public health situation, but also as we're seeing with the protests, as we're seeing with nationwide conversations over race and policing, that in a public health situation, you need widespread compliance. And in our media environment where, as you said, Bill, people can be in their own echo chambers of political information, that gets much, much harder.
You mentioned the newspaper is a reliable source of information. What do you see the source of the printed media and the online media and the newspaper in general, and local news being conveyed to the newspaper, the local newspaper?
Yeah, so one of the big things that I tell my students, particularly with a good bit of local information, but also some national news information, is much of the information that they might be reading on a particular story has already been sourced from what's called a wire service, so the Associated Press or Reuters. And so what I often tell my students, particularly with newspaper sources and local newspaper sources or local online sources, is go to the original source. And so what a wire service, an Associated Press or Reuters service will give you is they will give you the who, what, where, when of a news event. And so that will give you the initial base of what's going on in the world. And then moving from there to other particular sources becomes really important in terms of if you want a little bit of the why behind it or interpretive kind of styles of journalism, the cable news will give you that as well. There are downsides to that, obviously, which we see in this particular environment that some cable news outlets can be more reliable than others. But at least when we're thinking about print news coverage and online news coverage, quite a bit of information is already being sourced from journalists who are doing the work at wire services like at the Associated Press or Reuters.
So one thing we see in this news is that some of the traditional sources of media, like the local TV stations, radio stations, the Tampa Times, are getting really aggressive online, making sure that they're inside those bubbles, that they're penetrating those bubbles so that people see the news. And then we also, in the last 10 years or so, have seen the rise of the blogs. And we see ones like, Florida Politics, as Peter says, he was sitting in his underwear in his bedroom typing, and now suddenly he's got like 30 reporters around the state. And so sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between news organizations that follow standard news practices versus somebody new who's starting out blogging their opinion. How do you advise your students to look through that?
Yeah, so what I tell my students is this is where a little bit of research on the person doing the reporting is important, as well as identification of the person. So oftentimes, if we think about what is either disinformation or misinformation that we will come across, one of the key items to think about is the stories that you might see that might be considered disinformation or misinformation don't identify who is writing it, don't identify the author of the information, or the author of the information might be projecting themselves to be an expert in a particular area of study. But if you do a quick Google search, you might see that they have not even studied or practiced in the area that they've done. We've seen that some with the coronavirus situation, that individuals who might not be epidemiological experts have been putting out information on the spread of the virus and those types of public health issues. So a quick Google search is oftentimes the best way in which you can uncover whether or not the person who might be a blog author, whether or not they are a recognized authority on those particular issues. So I tell my students that I will, oftentimes what happens is news media sources identify someone as an expert source, and news sources go through particular types of vetting techniques to make sure that they're getting accurate information from the sources that they're talking to.
Let me ask you first an ad for Café on Tampa. If you're watching live, this is 8 o'clock on Friday morning, please ask a question underneath the feed if you're on your phone, or to the right if you're watching on your computer. And please, we do this as a service to the community, share information as broadly as possible. So please hit the share button and share it with your friends and family. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit subscribe. Want to ask you, so this topic is about political communication. There's a lot of local races going on right now. National races. So if you were a local Tampa, St. Pete, Hillsborough, Pinellas politician running for office right now, what things should you consider in this particular environment?
So I'm not in the advice business anymore. I used to be a former academic in a former life before I was an academic. But I think one of the things that is critically important for really all candidates and really elected officials and government officials to consider is the ways in which they're putting out messages, the ways in which they're reaching diverse audiences in this environment. So what we've seen locally here in the Tampa Bay area, but also what many other local governments are doing at this time is they're doing things like emergency text alerts. They're doing things like calling individuals to make sure that they're getting potentially life-saving information related to the coronavirus. So being able to reach audiences in the places where they are. So a local candidate, for example, might not necessarily want to try to reach their target audience on a Twitter, on like a Twitter feed, for example, but maybe something like Facebook would be important. So in this particular environment, it's finding the audiences where they are, because people are so scattered in their information sources and where they look for information. And then also, I think the second thing is making sure that messages are aligned, particularly public health messaging. It's aligned with what recognized experts are saying about the situation in terms of the recommendations for individuals to make about wearing face masks, maintaining social distancing, those particular types of measures. We're seeing right now in Florida that one of the challenges over time is essentially, concern fatigue, that the initial concern about the coronavirus has kind of worn off. And what we're seeing is that public health officials, as well as government officials, are having to step in now to mandate particular public health behaviors like wearing masks to help compensate for the initial concern wearing off. The virus is still out there. We're seeing that in terms of the numbers that are coming in, and particularly in the Tampa Bay area. So we're seeing rises in numbers, and I think it's really important that messages from political candidates as well as government officials are being aligned with what public health experts are saying about the situation.
And one of the weird things.
That's my question, because you mentioned the need for wearing masks, social distancing, washing hands. I mean, that has been pretty consistent throughout this entire period of time. But how is and still when I go out, I see people not wearing masks, not observing social distancing. Yeah. And I don't know about washing hands. Where is the disjunct between what we need to do to get over this and accelerate it and the political communications that's occurring?
Yeah, really great question, Del. So what I'm going to do is I want to share my screen with you because I have a few images to kind of illustrate some of these particular points about the importance of what's going on here in terms of thinking about the messages that are being put out by our political leaders, and specifically thinking about that the consistency of messages from political leaders in multiple parties are really important. So this, for example, the front image here was Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York during one of his press conferences getting a coronavirus test to encourage individuals in New York to get tested for the virus. So these types of modeling behaviors are particularly important in terms of making sure that the public understands what is at stake and the public understands the actions that they can take to be able to potentially mitigate a public health crisis. So you see, for example, you have political leaders engage in activities like running to illustrate healthy behaviors that individuals can do. So, presidents of both parties, political leaders of both parties do this. But in a public health crisis, you also see particular examples of leaders modeling these certain behaviors. So, for example, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, during the HIV/AIDS kind of epidemic, the height of it, First Lady Barbara Bush, she visits essentially a location that is treating and caring for HIV/AIDS patients, and she holds a baby that is infected with HIV. And what this does is it communicates a particular message about really combating misinformation about casual contact and whether or not that can spread the virus at that time. And so there's rampant misinformation at that time that casual contact can spread it. And we know that that is not necessarily the case with HIV/AIDS. So Barbara Bush holds a baby to illustrate that casual contact and human contact is important for individuals. I mean, we see that in 2009, Barack Obama, for example, gets a flu shot during concern about H1N1 in terms of concern about the global epidemic at that time related to that. So he gets a flu shot to encourage individuals and to tell them that getting a flu shot is safe. In 2015, Barack Obama, for example, hugs a patient who had recovered from Ebola. So we're hearing a lot in this epidemic about and pandemic about the concern about what has the government done in the past. And so these are two instances where government leaders have engaged in particular actions to model particular types of behavior that either things are okay or things will be okay. We see Governor DeSantis wearing a mask at particular moments and modeling this particular type of behavior. We also see our local mayors, Pastor and Kreisman, doing this and being very deliberate about the ways in which they're messaging this. So Mayor Kreisman, even on social media, has been adopting kind of the phrase "a mask up" to encourage individuals to remind them to wear a mask in public. One of the challenges, though, is that we oftentimes get, for example, the message from the White House, from the president, has been inconsistent on masks. So this is actually the one instance where we've seen the president wear a mask when he was touring a Ford plant. But in general, most of the images that we see of the president currently when he is meeting with individuals or talking with individuals about the coronavirus are these ones, where he might either be surrounded by public health professionals who are wearing a mask, or he's surrounded by individuals who are not wearing a mask. So in these particular instances, it's really important to understand that while this isn't necessarily a cure-all for some of these challenges that we face, it is important for government leaders to model the behaviors that they want individuals to engage in publicly.
Don't forget, everybody who's watching live, please share this if you haven't already so your friends and family can see. And then also, if you have any questions, please post underneath or to the right. Oh, I wonder if you wouldn't mind tell me if this isn't what you want to talk about today, but considering the current environment also with the protests, there's a lot of sensitivity to words and language, and there's a lot of learning going on. Politicians have mentioned words that they had used forever that they didn't know how to double or triple meaning. There are businesses that where people innocently, I think innocently posted "All Lives Matter," not knowing the implications of that. How do people find out about the double and triple meanings of words, and or how would people check to make sure they're not saying something they shouldn't be saying?
So this is in some ways where the task of listening to each other is really important, and being reflexive in our thinking is particularly important. So understanding that if we're confronted about something we say, our first probably reaction is reactance to in terms of face threat, that we might find that threatening in some type of way. But one of the things that we know is that we all have implicit biases in terms of the ways in which we orient ourselves to the world. So understanding that, and understanding that we will make mistakes in terms of our communication, but that having an open mind and really open ears to understand particularly what we're seeing is the really challenging historical legacies of some of the language and words that we use, and the etymologies of where they've come from. So the University of Florida is looking at this right now with some of its sports cheers and its school cheers. I know the University of Texas at Austin is looking at this. I'm a graduate. I got my PhD at UT Austin. They're looking at this with the Eyes of Texas song. It really is a matter of understanding that oftentimes the argument against change is that we've always done it this way. It's tradition. One of the things I talk about in my classroom is an argument from tradition is an argumentative fallacy. It's just because something has been done doesn't mean it's the right way to be done. And oftentimes what we know in the United States is that many of our traditions and legacies do have the imprints of bigotry and oppression behind them, and we don't even realize it. So I think understanding as opposed to initial reactance will go a long way to potentially correcting these things. And I think the key thing is, particularly for businesses and elected officials or political officials, is being okay admitting that you didn't know. and that a person is open to learning and understanding. And that I think is very important for how many individuals who just haven't seen something can open up their eyes to potentially see it.
Del, do you have a final question? We're almost out of time already. Time's gone fast.
How do you think we can come together? I mean, these are turbulent times. Not only are we dealing with a virus that is really needs to be cured by the scientists, but then we have human rights issues that are being discussed. And these all affect all of our lives. What are 1, 2, and 3 simple steps that we can come back together again?
The first that I always go to is when we think about when we think about the arguments or kind of the disagreements that really divide individuals. I often go to the way that really we can understand one another is think about what common places we have. So we might be arguing particular different points of view, but there might be a common place that unites individuals in terms of wanting communities to be better, wanting greater understanding, those particular types of things. So finding that understanding and starting from there and seeing and tracing back arguments to see where disagreement is important. So in a democracy, the ways in which we talk and deliberate, we will have disagreement. But how do you move past it to at least try to get something done, to at least try to make some particular progress is very important. So starting with those common places is really important. The second thing is we have to talk with people who disagree with us. And we have to talk with people who will potentially make us uncomfortable. And that doesn't necessarily mean acceptance or even tolerance of particular views, but it is important to, at least from our own perspective, understand where others are coming from. That might then influence our behavior and our ways of communication. We might decide that some individuals hold particular views that are outside the norms of particular civil society. That is important. But in general, with what we're talking about with policy arguments or political types of arguments, it's important that we engage other people who disagree, and we engage them in a way that is pointed, but is also recognizes our shared humanity. So I think those are 2 key points.
I'll hit you with my final question. How do we build a community consensus? So for all listening within our own bubble, we're communicating within our own bubbles. How do we connect the bubbles so that we share on a broader scale, not just the one-on-one, but how do we bring groups of people together to build consensus around an issue?
One of the things we know from the academic research, especially on networks, is that it is actually the people in our networks that we might only have passing interactions with. So what kind of network researchers call our weak ties. These might be our work colleagues or individuals we might see on a fairly irregular basis, but these are the individuals that are actually the ones who expose us to different information, new perspectives. So the people in our immediate circles, our friends, our family, the people we talk to on a regular basis in general agree with us. This is partly the reason why when you might talk with a family member or a close friend and they say, well, everyone I talk to thinks this way or thinks about this. We are gravitated to people who think like us. So that's why it's important in our networks to seek out the people who maybe we might only have a chancing interaction with. Those are the individuals who will potentially expose us to different perspectives and link us to different understandings and networks. That information might make us uncomfortable. And that's the key thing, which is how do we encourage individuals to bring in a little bit of discomfort in terms of how they see the world. That I think is an important task for what I try to seek in the classroom for students, what we should try to be advocating for in terms of understanding and flexibility of different types of information that are out there.
Well, that's what we try to do with Café Tampa. is
Mhm.
bring in dissimilar ideas and have meaningful discussion and respectful discussion. And often we try to bring in people of different ideas
Mhm.
and make sure that the audience is respectful of their opinion. And hopefully, isn't that our mission, Bill?
Yeah, and someone just posted that travel when we're allowed to do it again is a great way to learn about other people's perspectives
Yep.
and this too. Our president PJ Somerville is listening. I want to thank her and the other board members. Dell and I are just two of the board members, and we're standing in during this online time. Barbara Deacon is another board member. Sandy Reeve. We want to thank them, and thanks to all of our viewers and listeners. We hope to be back in person again soon. We'll continue some kind of online programming, but we'll hopefully get back in person soon. And thank you so much to Josh here for communicating with us. And when you have another research thing, let us know. We'll invite you back. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Bill and Dell. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, do you want to tell us your website or anything, Josh?
Sure. So if anyone would like more information about the Sunshine State Survey, you can find it at sunShineStateSurvey.org. We have our results up there from our latest coronavirus survey. So go and check that out. You can also follow up with me by email at jscacco@usf.edu. I'll be happy to answer any questions that maybe you had for today that we couldn't necessarily get to. So thanks so much, everyone out there, for listening and viewing today.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Watch our Facebook events for our upcoming events and look forward to seeing you next time. Take care. Thanks.